Welcome to Culture Talk. This is the segment where we talk about the intersection of science, faith, and pop culture and how culturally relevant topics can be used to start conversations about your faith. And I'm joined with biochemist Fazale Rana. We're going to be talking about Netflix's The Creative Brain.
Yeah, that's a great documentary that's informative, inspirational, and even prescriptive, where it tells you, based on brain science, how you can unleash your creativity.
Oh, yeah, totally. I was watching it the other day. I was cooking and I just had Netflix on. And here's this thing that came up recommended. And I was watching it and I was surprised it wasn't a Christian documentary. It was, based on science, and yet it pointed to so many things that we talk about here. One of the things it talks about is the difference between animals and humans and how there was a change in the input and output in our brains that helped develop the creativity. Can you explain that?
Yeah. Well, this documentary was hosted and narrated by David Eagleman, who is a neuroscientist and who studies the brain science behind creativity. And he points out that it was our expanded prefrontal cortex that essentially created a separation in our brain between the regions that receive sensory input and those regions that then direct the animal to respond to that input.
So we have this change. They would call it an evolutionary change.
Yeah.
What prompted that change from an evolutionary perspective? Like, what would be the benefit of even that change developing?
Yeah, well, it looks as if what happens is when the input and the output centers of the brain are separated by brain matter, it gives time for that input to interact with other sensory input that the brain is receiving, as well as memories of past experiences or ideas, which represent kind of a coalescence of a lot of information. And that ends up triggering our capacity to be creative. And so for a rat, as an example, the input and the output areas are right next to each other, which means if a rat sees food, its response is going to be to eat the food. But when we see food, we then think about, well, is it possible for me to artistically depict the food? Can I arrange the food in a pleasing way? Can I cook the food or prepare the food and combine it with other foods to create, something that's completely original, that's completely different? And so that space and that interaction that takes place in our brain really makes human beings unique compared to every other creature that exists.
And the narrator even mentioned that. He said rats or animals of old are behaving the same as animals of today, but not for humans, at least as from an evolutionary perspective. Modern humans, as they would say, are behaving totally different. But again, what would be the evolutionary benefit for creativity?
Well, the standard evolutionary story would be that our creativity led to technology that allowed us to be able to expand as a species to cover the entire planet, to be the dominant species. That creativity led to our evolutionary success. But when you think about it a little bit more carefully, you realize that it's got to be more complicated than that, because human beings, when we first appear on Earth, though we're engaged in pretty sophisticated behavior, it was still hunter-gatherer type of behavior, where it was really very primitive, archaic technology that we're employing. And so when you live a hunter-gatherer lifestyle, you've got to collect food, you've got to kill animals in order to eat. You can't afford to be creative. You can't afford to spend time making art, making music, learning how to dance and those kind of things. You've got to spend your effort trying to gather food. And yet when we look at archaeological sites for the oldest modern humans, they're just dominated with evidence for symbolism. And so it's almost as if creativity would, in effect, work against our survivability initially as a species, and it's only later that creativity actually leads to our capacity to dominate the world.
So when we think about the evolutionary response to why we would have creative expression, how can we then look at that in light of a Christian perspective, and how does the Christian faith explain creativity?
Yeah. Well, to me, what is being highlighted here is that we are exceptional as human beings. We stand apart from all other creatures. And this is the biblical view of humanity, that we're made in God's image, that we're uniquely made in God's image. We're the crown of creation. We're different than anything that God has ever made before. And what separates us from the animals is the image of God. And I think creativity is very much part of the image of God. And so, because our God is the creator, and because we're made in his image, we're many creators. And so whenever we create, we invent, whether it is technology or art or music, what have you, we are manifesting the image of God. And I believe we're bringing glory to God. And one of the things that was really, I think, inspirational in this documentary was the role that people were using, or the use of creativity, to help people that were in prisons to rehabilitate themselves. That these people viewed themselves based on the mistakes that they made that led them to wind up in prison.
Right.
And that's how they viewed themselves. But when they had like Tim Robbins, who's an actor, come in and do acting classes, or a novelist come in and actually help them to become creative writers, that unleashed something in them that helped them to see themselves beyond just simply the mistakes they made.
Right.
They began to see themselves as a whole person.
Right.
And that's saying to me that we are compelled to create. It's part of our identity. And if we can't create, it somehow diminishes us as human beings.
Right. I think that's an excellent point, and I think it's such a motivation for us as creative people that we want to not only engage in creative acts, but we also want to inspire other people because it helps them get in touch with their true identity as being made in God's image. So thank you so much for talking about that. If you'd like to hear more on this topic, visit reasons.org and search human exceptionalism.